So one of the questions that was online is, do you have current statistics for how many confirmed diagnoses of VRS there are?
So I can only tell you what I have on the slide here. So we know of over 70 cases here. I know of, I think probably if Dr. Russell and I put our numbers together with just what we know informally, I do think we've probably hit over 100 around the world, but I don't think we're over 200. So my best estimate is we're somewhere in that neighborhood, 100 to 200 around the world right now.
So I have an Excel spreadsheet of families who have contacted me. And in a very informal count, we're at about 250 families. Individual families who have contacted us, joined the group, not joined the group. And I always encourage research. I always ask them to join, but so if you have any tips on how to encourage people to join research, we'll talk to you. Okay.
All right, another one from online is for Dr. Bianca Russell. What will the future look like for our kids? Is there, and actually this is for both of you, for what research is going on for treatment of the syndrome? Is there stem cell therapy research, things like that?
So hopefully my talk answered some of those questions, because these questions before the talk happened. We don't have a specific medication or treatment, so to speak, that's in the works. There are some treatment strategies that I use in my clinic that have been successful with many families, and that just comes from sort of experience and talking to all of you. What also helps is many of you reach out to me and tell me when things aren't going well with your child and when you figured something out, and so I sort of keep a log of those things, and we've been able to sort of recycle some of the strategies you all come up with and use those for other families. And I think that's exactly what Dr. Chung was saying as well, is that the families, you guys actually are living this and you discover things and you find that it works, and when you tell us about it, we go and tell other providers and other families about it, and sometimes that can honestly be the best way to do sort of an organic process of treatment that happens. So that's sort of the current process that we have, but I think as we build the research side of things, I wouldn't be surprised if in the future there became some therapeutics that were available, but we're not there yet.
I'll say that's generally true. The challenge that we have for rare diseases is just to some of the statistics, it takes generally 10 years to develop a drug for any drug. And that's usually once we understand what the problem is and how to be able to attack it. So it's a long process in terms of being able to get something like that for a new drug. And that's why we emphasize so much. I guess my motto is usually the cure is over cure. And I'm not saying that we're going to have a cure in terms of being able to do this anytime soon, but we are trying to emphasize a lot of the cure, which is what Dr. Russell is also saying.
Does anybody here in the room have any questions before we go ahead?
So for Dr. Russell, I saw in last year's presentation you had said that a new finding was peripheral neuropathy. So what's happened with that? What are you seeing? Are there symptoms we should be looking out for? Should we be talking to their neurologist or orthopedist? So yes, what's happening with that?
So my last year there was some talk. There was a patient of mine that had was a patient that was normally walking and then had more pain and was sort of stopping walking as an adolescent, and had the arches of her feet that had gotten really, really high and more contractures that had developed of her toes. And so we looked at it and said this looks concerning for more of a peripheral nerve damage type process. We have not found anybody else that's had that process, but I think the point being is that if many of your children, particularly who are wheelchair bound, will develop contractures with age, and that's something that we know. But when things are not quite right, it's worth taking that extra look, and I think that was sort of the message that I wanted to pass along with that. Again, we haven't found any more of that, but the idea is that sometimes these things look like, oh, okay, the child doesn't walk and they're in a wheelchair and they have more contractures because that's what happens in kids who are in wheelchairs who get older. But the truth is that sometimes there's something else going on as well. So having that extra sense that it is possible that there could be other processes at play. We haven't seen anything else from that regard, but I think that message rings true with everything. And I think all of you guys have experienced that, where you've said to your provider, something's not right, this isn't making sense, and you get the routine answer of, well, this is just what happens with this condition, or don't worry about it. And it's sort of a little bit of having to be an advocate for your patient, for your children, and then also communicating with us as the researchers and letting us know when these things are happening, because there may be a pattern that's established over time. We have so few families, even though over 250, that's fantastic. It's still not that many, and there are rare things that happen that we should be aware about.
So to whose attention do you bring neuroconference?
You're welcome to talk to us at the registry and the biobank. I sort of collect this information, just families just tell me, and it is something we ask about in the registry as well. But when there's very specific things that are happening, sometimes I kind of pull those out and focus on them. And if there's a group of families that are coming forward saying all these things are happening to our child, that's when we talk about, do we need to discuss a management strategy that works for the whole community related to that. So I think Dr. Tan and I are probably the ones for ASXL 1 and 2, or 1 at least, and Dr. Pena and Shashi are both involved in the ASXL 2 side, and then Dr. Chung is sort of taking the lead on ASXL 3. So I think between all our group, we're pretty well covered in sort of having point people for each of the conditions.
Two-part question. Dr. Chung, so it's a great question. So we don't really know prognosis or long-term yet of ASXL3. Did I understand that correctly?
So basically, it's projecting.
So basically, it's projecting outward, but I would say I'm not seeing that this is a degenerative condition. It's more what I would call a developmental condition. So as we get over the first 10 years, I think we can kind of see where things are going. So with the exception that, like I said, we're slim on data on the both.
Second part, not connected. So Searchlight only wants ASXL 1 and 2 families, but you said that you're very interested, especially for mosaics. So how do we do that for you?
So I'm sorry this is so confusing. So ASXL 3, the BRS, falls under the Searchlight sort of umbrella at this point. ASXL 1 and 2 is what Dr. Russell is leading in terms of things like that. So if you're mosaic and under ASXL 3, Searchlight will take care of that. And if you're mosaic or not, then ASXL 1 or 2, then Dr. Russell will take care of that.
Are there any other questions here in the room?
It's just simple. How do we know if you're a mosaic?
So anyway, on the genetic test report, there is oftentimes a line that will say one or the other parent is a mosaic. And if you just scan your test report and it says anything about mosaic, come and talk to one of us.
Thank you both for being here. This one is, I'm going to direct to you, Dr. Chung, because I know that this is a question that a lot of BRS families have. There's been a lot of energy spent in our Facebook group in trying to help each other decipher our genetic reports, and specifically the chain of the gene, and if there is a, wherever your mutation occurs, does that correlate to your impact, your severity of the syndrome? And we're all trying to help each other, but we all can't make sense of it, and wondering if you can maybe give us some quick pointers on that.
So one of the things, and Lisa, who's over here, one of the genetic counselors who works with us, is going to help put together this figure that I think is going to be helpful for you guys on this. So each one of these is the string address in terms of where your particular change is. This question came up indirectly when the scientists were talking yesterday, and so I did a quick look at the data that we had, at least as part of Simon's Searchlight. It's not clear that the location is telling us exactly about severity. I won't go into all the details, but I think the scientists have some ideas that each of the mutations may not be acting in the same way, but there may be differences specifically in these changes. So it's not necessarily about the rest of the genes in the genome. It's not just about, if you were born premature or not, or things like that. There may be fundamental differences in terms of the genetic change, but it's a numbers game. And so I, and I think many others in this room, have done this for other diseases. And to do those types of analyses to get the answers the families want oftentimes takes at least 100 individuals with information on their genetic change and their clinical severity to be able to come up with those associations and come up with that information. So it's very possible. We know exactly how to do it. It's just that we have to all put our heads together and put our information together to come up with those correlations. I do think some of what Dr. Russell was referring to in terms of being able to look at the methylation is potentially a very proximal biochemical readout in terms of getting a direct sort of answering a question of whether or not that will correlate with prognosis. And if it does, I think long-term it's going to be very helpful to parents of young children especially. So anyway, the bottom line is, no, we don't have the answer to the question yet. We have some ideas, but I think they're just hypotheses or just guesses at this point. Very good. And there's a path forward in terms of doing that.
And so this question's come up in the ASXL one community in the exact same capacity. So one of my students and I, we actually plotted out all of the genetic mutations seen in the ASXL1 gene within the registry and in the published literature. So this is a graph of sort of the ASXL1 gene, and then all those individual lines are the specific mutations that have been reported. And what we tried to do is develop a scale where we rated each of the individuals as being mild, moderate, or severe. We couldn't do it for all of it because the published patients didn't have enough data for us to make sort of a score. So when we look at it, you can see that all of the genetic changes are very clustered towards the end of the gene, and that there are green, yellow, and red sort of interspersed within that range. So our best efforts at this point, we were not able to associate a specific genetic change or location of change with a severity. But again, I think the methylation patterns may be a really nice tool for us to do that in the future. But we haven't found anything yet.
So we should not spend energy trying to
You
figure it out
should
right now.
not spend energy
Spend
on
energy
that. Many other things to spend your energy on, and that's probably not your highest yield one.
If we got the whole exome sequencing, exome sequencing like years ago, somewhere we must have our report. If you ever find that there's a correlation, do our reports have this level of detail so that we could pull it up and say, here, now look at this and see if you can correlate it? Or like once you've already been tested, it's too late?
No, so what's written in your report is those things that are vertically, that is the language we use to report the address of the genetic change, and that shouldn't change. So all reports should be that.
Okay, one from the internet. We're just gonna stick this in here. So this is for either of you. It was for PRS. So could CRISPR or Cas9 be a possibility to correct gene in the ASXL3? I think that's equally valid.
What is that?
Yeah, so the question, what is that CRISPR-Cas9? So this is what some of you may have heard about, gene surgery, gene editing, fixing genes, things like that. So the technology itself actually works quite well. It's a tool that we use in the laboratory all the time. The scientists actually are quite familiar with this. It poses some challenge therapeutically in people to be able to do. Number one is because you need to be able to get it likely into all the cells of the brain if it were to actually have its intended effect. The other thing we don't know is what part of this is developmental in terms of it happens even before a baby's born, and how much of that can reverse the clock on. I don't think we know at this point. I would also say there are some very significant safety issues to be addressed before we start doing this in people. So it's a great thing to be watching, but at this point it's in the watching phase, and I think we need to continue it caring while we're doing that watching.
For ASXL3, you mentioned that you're starting to look at like things like scoliosis. I'm just wondering if you've also seen things like advanced bone age and precocious puberty and stuff like that.
Very good. So I haven't seen it so much in terms of reports for BRS yet, but I will say that across neurological conditions that are similar to this, precocious puberty is not uncommon. So I won't be surprised if I see it, and based on the signals back from the brain that regulate puberty. But what I am concerned about is more long term. Anyway, and that's just because people that are not bearing weight on their bones tend to have weaker bones and also can have problems with bone fractures, and those just set kids back so much. And I can tell you for myself, that sets me back so much.
So that's actually great, because I have a follow-up question. So, if we have children, like my child's 9, and you know, she's showing no interest in walking, and it's really hard to get her bear weight on her legs, are there things that we should be looking for or doing to be proactive, you know, while we're trying to get her to walk? Like, what are the kinds of things that we should watch out for in terms of, you know, the side effects of not bearing weight on?
So this is just general, and I'm sure Dr. Russell has advice too. So weight bearing, even if not walking, is a good thing. So that's number one. At some point, I'm sure you're going to be doing bone mineral density studies. I'm not saying you have to do it, you know, in terms of your daughter's a little young at this point. But there are medications that we use for older women, for mostly women, but with people with osteoporosis, and it may be that there are things that we need to do to increase bone mineral density for our kiddos. But the good thing is there are lots of options for that, and I think it's something we need to continue watching for. In the near term, my biggest concern though is scoliosis.
I'd say for boring open syndrome, we're seeing osteoporosis, bone fractures, and precocious puberty. And I think some of that has to do with many more of the boring open syndrome children are not walking, which makes that a higher risk for that as well.
Here.
This is primarily for Dr. Russell because of the more medical complexity of BOS. Have you found a trend in causes of mortality, and does it differ throughout the lifespan? I know we've had you know, a grouping of children pass away before, you know, the age of 4 or 5, but recently you know, an 18-year-old, etc. And also, are there certain complications or declines in specific areas or symptoms or systems that we should be looking out for?
That's a great question. All I have up here is just from the registry. We do have a little bit of data about the patients in the registry who are deceased. And I would encourage all the families that are listening, if your child has passed away, that information is actually extremely valuable to us. So it can be difficult and painful. We have sort of a mechanism in place to make your sharing of your information easier for your family. But we do, that information is probably the most common question I get from families. It's something that I think a lot of people are thinking about. So these were the causes of death for the families that were in the registry. But you're right, there are some older children that have passed away recently. Again, the medical complexity of boring open syndrome makes these children at risk for any sort of... The medical complexity makes these kids at risk for an event at any time in their life. Kids with trachs who have trachs that are plugged and they can't breathe well, seizures, GI events have become more significant as well. And one case of malrotation where the gut twisted. And the complexity of evaluating these children when they're sick at the medical institutions they present at is very, very challenging. And there's a lot of room for there to be issues. They have lines, they have chronic tubes, they get infected. So all of these things are kind of universal in medically complex children, and they're not unique to the BOS population. I think one thing that has been becoming more evident is that as children are aging into adolescence, the psychiatric features are becoming more pronounced. And so that's an area that I'm seeing in my practice, and something that I'm collaborating with some local psychiatrists to try and understand that a little bit better. But there's quite a bit of concern with adolescents that there are psychiatric features that are present. And I believe there are some concerns too in the older BRS children as well. Things like hallucinations, auditory, stimulatory sensations that are abnormal, and that the children are not able to process those well. And so there's a lot of aggressive behaviors that are presenting, and things that are quite challenging for families to take care of. So I think that's something that we need to investigate a little more. It's particularly challenging in our individuals that are not verbal and can't communicate very well with us. So what I'm doing is working with some of our families who have adolescents who are more verbal or who are more communicative, and try and understand and if those individuals can help us understand a little bit more what's happening and what they're feeling. But again, it's a big challenge, and I think that as your children get older, this is something that we'll need to understand a little bit better. But it's important to think of those psychiatric issues, and actually one of the main things can be depression, which is something we don't always think about as a first line of processing, but your children can get depression just like other children, and as they get older, sometimes we're seeing more of that presenting. So it's something that is worth getting evaluated and seeing a psychiatrist who specializes in kids with special needs, who may be able to help you sort through that process. So I think as kids are getting older, that is one of the things that's coming up more frequently that we need to understand a little bit better.
Are any other questions here? Hello? Yes. Oh, go ahead.
Say we have one from Brazil. We have one from Brazil. What's your opinion about the use of growth hormone for BRS? Addition to growth in height, in addition to growth in height and muscle mass, is it possible that there's positive benefits with treatment?
So this is not evidence-based, this is just based in general on a lot of practice with kids with neurodevelopmental genetic disorders. So BRS kids don't have a deficiency in growth hormone, and so you can, and growth hormone, some of you know, is an injectable medication. You will override the system in terms of gaining probably a couple inches in terms of final adult height. You will gain in terms of increasing lean body mass, in other words, muscle mass, and that does help with muscle tone a little bit. It probably, this is for the United States, I don't practice in Brazil, so I'm not sure that this applies in Brazil. It is an expensive medication, and it is not approved for the use in BRS, and so in general, it won't be approved for use in the United States. And I'm not really, again, the modest gains that you get from this, I do think are quite modest, so it's not something that I recommend in terms of treatment. In general, the little amount of growth that you get isn't the difference, it's a night and day difference in terms of how the kids are functioning or socially how they're doing. And I haven't seen a difference in terms of brain function. So for those reasons, it's, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's a commonly asked question. Dr. Russell, feels like
Are there any other questions here?
As far as like weight gain, and I know they base it in, it's usually on the leaner side, is that correct? Well, we have my grandson is tube fed, and it seems like we're just continually just feeding him and continually having a lot of gas and different things, and a lot of issues with bending and things like that. Now, I'm just wondering, do they base that like on a typical kid, or do they tend to be less, and we have a lot of problems sitting up and different things? Are they trying to give up too much food, or this is just part of his thing, that he's going to be on the smaller side, and they're trying to make him on the larger side?
And I just want to make sure I heard, you said your grandson has BRS?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll say this, and again, Dr. Russell or any of the other medical geneticists can chime in. BRS is basically you're programmed to be a different height, you're programmed to be shorter, and so in terms of nutritional support, what I do is you can actually see the appropriate weight for height, and I try and optimize that. So you're trying to get someone who's not too skinny, who's not too thick, in terms of how you decide about calories. And you can titrate, so you can move, especially if you're G-tube fed, you can easily titrate up or down in terms of the calories. And to me, that's what you're trying to do, is optimize so that you're the right weight for the height. If you continue to pour in too many calories, you get wider, but you don't get taller. So you know that you shouldn't keep going on that. If there are problems in terms of malabsorption, all the calories may not actually be getting in, and so that's why I said it's a titration thing. You can actually calculate the energetics and figure out how many calories should be needed, but those don't always match, and that's because there can be malabsorption issues.
So one of the GI features that we've seen widely reported in the boring open syndrome group, and I've also seen in several of the more severely affected BRS patients, is really what we call GI dysmotility. So the gut does not squeeze and pass the food through it in the way that it should. And so the gut is very slowed. And I think there's a GI doctor today who is an expert on dysmotility, so I'm not going to steal all of his thunder. But I think I would encourage you to really pay attention to that topic. You may get some more answers there. But what's going on with the digestive tract in these conditions is really a neurologic issue with the GI tract itself, which makes it more complicated. So while reflux is sort of what you outwardly see and is what commonly is diagnosed, it's truly more of a dysfunction of how the gut is operating. And I think, again, once you hear that talk this afternoon, I think you may get some more information about that.
My question is another BRS. If it is mainly a developmental problem, my child is also medically complex. So, am I looking at two different things, or could it possibly be the same thing, and it just isn't connected?
So I'm pretty sure it's the same thing. So BRS, although as you know, we were talking about, a lot of it is related to the brain or brain effects on other parts of the body. It is very likely it's all wrapped up in one thing. And you'll see, if you haven't already, from the families, there are many BRS kiddos that are more medically complex and have many other features. And I think you'll see the similarities that are BRS, not specific, but that are definitely BRS related.
It's what we call a spectrum across the board for all of these conditions, and every child's individual, and they don't all fit into a perfect box with a bow, but there are certainly similarities across the board that we see, and there are some that are more complicated than others.
So I just want to follow up on the GI question that was asked. So what I actually tell parents, and this really echoes what Dr. Chung has said, is that it's really important to think of this as in the younger child, weight for length, and in the older children, your body mass index, which is really the same measure. And what you really want to aim for is for your child to be on approximately the 50th percentile thereabout. You really do not want your child to be up in 90th percentile. I've seen a lot of children, certainly with boring open syndrome, where their local doctors are really worried about failure to gain weight, they keep pumping them with calories. And as Dr. Chung says, you grow wider, you don't grow taller, and eventually you end up with all the complications of obesity, which is an additional problem. And it becomes much harder for you to manage and handle as well. So it's really important to actually keep them at a healthy weight. Now, if your child is already heavy and on sort of 80th, 90th percentile, what I generally recommend is we do not want them to lose weight, but you sort of want their weight gain to be at a slower rate than expected, so that over time, they will eventually reach sort of the 50th percentile of their health.
Because he's at 12% right now, and go like we
That's perfect.
No, so just to clarify, I think the confusion is, so you don't want individually the weight, your child's probably never going to have 50th percentile for height or 50th percentile for weight. What you want is that when we compare, we actually graph the weight and length together, that you can hit 50th percentile.
He's tall and thin.
Yes, exactly. So that you can get there. So even if your child is not on the growth curve at all and is multiple standard deviations below, when you graph the length and the height together, that's what you want to be well balanced. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so it looks like we're running out of time, but if there's anybody who has a really pressing question that I didn't get to answer or to ask. Okay, so just had a finishing up.
Yeah, I just want to, I don't know if you guys can hear me. I just want to say, given the strong interest in the research community to get blood samples that both of the researchers talked about, just if you're thinking about it during the break and want to sign up and you haven't, we have lots of slots available. If you're on ASXL 3, stop at the Searchlight desk. And I know Dr. Russell's coordinator is out there too if you haven't scheduled for ASXL ASXL 1 or 2. So just, we've got slots left, but I know some some families are gonna be going to the park maybe tomorrow morning. So we're also drawing in the morning, but if you're wanting to take advantage of that, you might wanna grab a slot today. Okay.
We are only drawing today until noon for the ASXL 1 and 2.
So I guess we'll go on a break until, what was it, 11? It's 11, so we'll go on a break until 11. Thank you.